Let me start this video with a question. What is the best camera? Yes, the best camera is the one that's with you. Since everyone has smartphone these days and smartphones cameras are improving year after year, in this video we will discuss about smartphone photography and videography. So there are some basic concepts that in photography that we need to understand. First is the aperture. Aperture is the hole through which the light enters the lens to get into the camera or the sensor. So this aperture can be controlled to limit the amount of light that's entering through the lens. Next is the shutter. Like aperture is on the lens, shutters on the camera just before the sensor. It's a screen that's just before the sensor that can open and close, and we can control how long it should open so that we can control the amount of light falling on the sensor. So as I said, aperture is on the lens, shutters on the camera, ISO is on the sensor itself. So basically ISO is image sensor optimization. I would say S instead of sensor as sensitivity. Here we'll try to increase the sensitivity of the sensor to light so that even there is less light in that, it will be able to capture the light to provide you a brighter picture. But there's also some drawbacks on ISO, wherein when you go higher the ISO number, it would introduce a lot of digital noise, as it's trying to amplify every single light that's getting in or falling on the sensor. So these three things may not be able to be controlled from the mobile camera. Some pro modes in the camera lets you control the ISO and shutter. Samsung phones, the recent phones, lets you control the aperture, but most of the mobile phone lenses are usually fixed aperture ones. But in pro mode, you should be able to control the shutter and ISO. But ignoring all the pro mode like a normal user would do, you just open up your camera app and then click pictures. So you can still control these parameters or control the exposure on the camera. So the concept that we use to control that, or the terminology here, is exposure compensation. What is exposure compensation? Exposure compensation is nothing but you're trying to override what camera thinks to be the right exposure. So when camera thinks that depending on the scene, it determines the exposure and it sets it to 0, which becomes the exposure that the camera has determined to be appropriate for this specific scene. But as a photographer or a user, you would think that maybe the image could be a little more brighter or a little more darker, depending on how you want the output to be. You can override the exposure here. So we can go towards the positive side, which is +1, 2, 3, which is going to brighten up the image, or you can go the negative side, which is going to darken up the image. This example image shows you the difference in exposure compensation. Exposure compensation can be adjusted directly in your camera app. On iPhones, you can click on the focus button, and then you'll find a slider. You can increase or decrease the slider that will adjust the exposure compensation. In Android phones, you can see on the right side, you should see a sun icon which you can slide up or down. That should adjust the exposure for you. Next important thing that we're going to look at is composition. So the techniques that we have looked so far are that can be controlled on the camera, but composition is something that the user needs to have. So this composition is what makes your picture stand out or tell a story. So there are some basic things in composition. The first rule or guideline is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds basically tells you to break your frame into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. This gives you 9 equal parts, and you can find 4 intersecting points here. So the guideline is that you place your subject of interest at one of these 4 intersections. This so these four intersections are basically based on research. It is like these are the points where the viewer's eyes are first drawn into. Placing the subjects at these points also gives you a glimpse of the surrounding or the environment where the subject is in, so that this gives a viewer a context of where the subject is or what the subject is doing. Also, you can use these lines in order to align things or images along the lines, like horizons or any vertical buildings along these lines. That also helps aesthetically in composing an image. This is another example of the same. So there are times we have to put the subject on the center of the frame. So that's our next composition, which is centered composition. When we want to do a center composition is that when you want to ensure the focus of your viewer is drawn to the subject itself. So that's where you use centered composition. Also, when you shoot something with symmetry, that also looks beautiful when you have a centered composition. So these are some example of centered composition. Here you can see there's a symmetry here. So centered composition works very beautifully. Even in this shot, there's a very abstract one wherein you can see the focus is on the center and it gives you a beautiful background. A similar example here. So this is kind of a symmetry, and you can see that the intent here is to draw the attention to the subject which is in center of the frame. So coming up with the next composition technique, it's leading line. You would have seen this everywhere, but maybe you would have not explicitly noticed them. So leading lines, you can find it everywhere. You can find it on the roads, buildings. There are different things in architecture that you can find. So these are basically natural lines that are leading to something. So you can place the subject along the line where the line leads to, so that the user's eyes are naturally trying to follow the line. So when they follow the line, it leads to the subject naturally. So that's another way that you play tricks with the mind. And leading lines need not always be straight. It can be curved, just that it needs to lead through the image. Usually the leading lines start at the end of the frame, and then they move towards inside of the frame and pointing you to the subject. This image, you can see there's another one composition from the next one that we're going to talk about, which is frame within a frame. You can see there's a frame within the photo frame, right? That's our next technique, which is called frame in frame. So this is, as the name explains, right? This is done by framing the subject with something within the scene in the foreground or background. This kind of gives you or helps you draw the viewer's attention to the photo, and also kind of gives a depth and context to the image. This is another one example wherein the frame need not be actually looking like a frame, like a square, rectangle or something. It can be something as a boundary that kind of distinguishes or just gives you a proper focus into the subject that you're trying to show. This is another use of frame. You can see there are like a frame within frame within frame. It's an inception of frames. So this kind of gives you a different perspective of your image, and that makes it stand out. The next composition technique is rule of spaces. So you'd have seen images wherein you can see the subject isolated and there's a lot of space around it. So this space is called negative space, and the rule of space tells you where you want to have this negative space. How do you use this negative space? So this negative space is advised to be used in the direction where the subject is trying to move or trying to look at, so that gives a perspective to the viewer on where the subject is going to, or what the subject is looking at. That gives that perspective here. That's what makes the picture stand out or talk to the viewer, right? This is one example. Here in this subject, you can see the subject is looking at the space. So there's a lot of thoughts involved here, so that kind of conveys something or brings in some kind of an emotion that the photographer tries to convey. So finally, I'm going to suggest two different apps here that you can use on your mobile. One is Snapseed and the other one is Lightroom. So Lightroom lets you have a few options for free, and then for more advanced features you'll need to purchase a subscription, where Snapseed is free. It's both available on Android and iOS. So that lets you do pretty much most editing on your phone to get a better result from your picture. I'll show you further on how we can use Snapseed in order to work with your pictures and then get a creative output from them. Next important thing that we're going to discuss about is videography. So videography is again very interesting, because in photography is gonna be a still image, but in videography it's gonna be a moving image, right? So just to get some basic things right, so you just need to understand a bit on the frame rates part here, because that's how your video is gonna be played. So usually the movies are usually at like 24 frames per second, and the normal videos that you shoot are 30 frames per second. And when you capture at a very higher frames, then it helps you slow down the image. When you capture at lower frames, it helps you to get the image faster, right? So these are just some basic things, right? So how to make your video that you shoot interesting? So to make your video interesting, just add some movements. Like you can add a pan, you can add a tilt, you can add a reveal. You can basically add some movements to it to kind of give a perspective on what's happening around, what is the subject doing. These kinds of things can be done so that it gives the perspective better, and also since there's more dynamics in the shot, that helps the viewer to get engaged while watching the video, right? So these are something. So we can look about a few things that we can do with videography. One thing that's very common is time lapse. Time lapse technically is to capture images at a very slow rate and play them at normal speed, which makes the time go very fast. So when you capture something with time lapse, it helps you to see some things that you may not be able to see when you directly observe the subject. Say for example, something that happens over a span of time, right? So time lapse helps you to see that transition very faster, so that gives you a different perspective to what you've been seeing for so long, right? Some common things like sunset, sunrises, these kinds of movement in traffic. So these sort of things. Also time lapse can be done for these kinds of things, wherein you see something that happens at a very very slow rate, but you will not be able to enjoy this kind of beauty, right? So this time lapse lets you capture this image or a sequence of images over a period of time, and when you try to play them at a normal speed, that gives you a very new perspective or a new effect to the video that you may not be able to do when capturing a normal video. Another technique that's very similar to time lapse, but it has little differences, is hyperlapse. Hyperlapse, it's very simple. So with time lapse is more or less you are very static with very limited movements, but hyperlapse, there's a lot of movement involved, and there's a lot of perspective correction as well involved. It little more tedious than time lapse, but it gives you a very very interesting image than the time lapse. This is something that's very interesting. You can see here the focus is try to set on the top of this building as and when the image moves across the building, you can see the movement, but still the focus lies on the top of the building. This dynamics and change, right, that kind of gives you a very creative and interesting perspective in these videos. So that's another different thing that you can do with time lapse, which is hyperlapse. So there are two softwares I can recommend. One is Hyperlapse from Microsoft for the Android users, and you can use Hyperlapse from Instagram for the Apple users. Why this is required, right? So basically, when Hyperlapse, when you move, right, there's a lot of movement in the image, there's a lot of jerk and all these things involved. So this software helps you to stabilize those images so that you get a very smooth and cleaner output. So another important thing is slow motion, right? So we enjoy slow motion, we enjoy seeing things in slow motion. Again, some difference in the time lapse and slow motion, right? Slow motion is where you capture at a very high frame rate and then play it at a very normal speed. So that's where the slow motion is more effective, right? So slow motion helps you to see some things that you may not be able to see, that happens at a very fast pace that you want to stop the time and then enjoy, right? So that's where the slow motion helps us. Example, these videos wherein you can see the droplets, you can see them bouncing off, right? You may not be able to enjoy this directly, but in slow motion you'll be able to see that small movements. And also slow motion can help you emphasize a specific action in a sequence, right? That also helps you in giving that dynamics to an image, something like this. So you saw, right, this kinds of gives you a very nice perspective to your image. And one more thing that you can do is stop motion. Stop motion is also similar to time lapse, wherein you capture things at a very slow frame rate. In fact, every individual frame is how you design it and then capture it. So you move the subject here, you move the subject for every frame and then control the subject, so that when the captured images are run in the normal 24 or 30 frames per second, that gives you a very different effect, that gives you a sense of motion and things, right? But in case of hyperlapse and slow motion, there's one more thing that also needs to be counted. As said, right, a normal video is like 24 frames per second. When you try to capture these things, you need to calculate how long you want the videos to be, and based on that, how many frames that you want to capture. So that helps you determine how many shots you have to take, and then for the required output that required. So this is one example of stop motion. Okay, now this is a very important thing. When we're talking about video, audio plays a very important role. As said earlier, the movements and then dynamics what you have in the video will give you a very nice perspective or a dynamics to the video, but audio sets the mood. Audio makes the audience feel something, right? Depending on what type of audio that you choose for a video makes a lot of difference when a viewer is enjoying the video, right? So you can try to see if it's a very slow motion, you can try to find an audio that apps that, or if something that's very fast, some sports kind of things, you can choose a different type of audio. You can try to choose different audios so that you are able to appropriately set the mood for the video. So some applications here for video. So to make like quick montages and like videos, photo slideshows and stuff, you can use Quick. And to make brief editing on your videos, InShot will help. Both of these applications are available for both Android and iOS. There's some iOS specific apps, that is iMovie and Spark. These also helps you get some creative shots done. This is what I usually use.